Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Madalene Mielke, APAC's President and CEO. Welcome to the final panel of APAC's Legislative Leadership Series. Today, we will be talking with a panel of amazing community leaders about the diversity of the AAPI community, its unique needs and perspectives, and how we can all work together to advocate effectively. Unfortunately, due to last-minute unforeseen circumstances, Lakshmi Sridharan from South Asian Americans Leading Together is unable to join the panel today. However, Nisha Ramachandran, Chair of DESI's for Progress, will be filling in for her. It is now my privilege to introduce the moderator of today's discussion, Phil Tajitsu Nash. Phil is an adjunct lecturer at University of Maryland, where he teaches Asian Pacific American history, art, and public policy courses. He has served as founding executive director at the Asian American Justice Center, staff attorney at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund, ALDEF, and curator of the APA program at the Smithsonian Institution's 2010 Folklife Festival. Phil has taught APA courses for over 30 years and recently summarized his experiences in an article in Speech. Phil is also affiliated with the University of Maryland Latin American Studies Center based on his decades of work with Native Americans in North America and Brazil on human rights, culture, and language issues. He has been active in the AAPI community for many years, including working with many of the organizations represented on this panel. His long history of work with our communities makes him the perfect person to guide us through this conversation. One quick reminder, for those joining us on Facebook, please put your questions in the comment section. And if you're joining the webinar, please use the Q&A chat box feature. Phil, it's all yours.
Thank you, Madalene. That was a very nice introduction. Of course, you're one of the amazing community leaders too. I wish we could get some of your insights here. But it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists. This is a very distinguished panel, and we're going to have some very interesting insights today. What I'm going to do is to ask each of them to give a little bit of a self-introduction. And as they talk about themselves, you'll be learning more about the groups that they're in and also some of the other groups that they've been working in the past, because many of these people do good work, not just in one forum. So let's start with Greg Orton, who's the National Director of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans. Greg?
Hi, thanks, Phil, and thanks, Madalene and Apex, for hosting this great panel. Good to be with you all. Again, my name is Greg Orton. I'm the National Director of the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, and we are the large coalition, umbrella coalition, of 37 of the most influential Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community organizations around the country. Our member organizations have chapters and affiliates across the country, and so our network really covers a lot of ground. Our approach to work ranges from policy-specific approaches, whether it's healthcare or housing, immigration, or civil rights. And then we have community organizations that represent Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander communities themselves. And so it's really an honor to be with you all today. Looking forward to the conversation and really excited to have so many of my colleagues here with me as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Let's hear now from Sina Sam, who's the Partnership Manager at the Southeast Asian Resource Action Center, also known as SEARAC. Sina?
Sure. Thank you so much, Phil, and thank you for having us here. SEARAC is the only Southeast Asian American civil rights organization advocating for Cambodians, Laotians, Hmong, and Vietnamese communities, who's the largest refugee community to be resettled in the U.S. We are a little younger organization at 41 years old now, and we work across collaborations with other organizations such as the ones with us today. And so I'm happy to be here to connect on the things we share, as well as the places we can continue to work together.
Thank you, Sina. Let's turn then to Tavae Samuelu, who is the Executive Director at Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, EPIC.
Thanks, Phil. Again, my name is Tavae Samuelu, she, her pronouns. I have the honor and privilege of being the Executive Director of EPIC. EPIC is a national organization that's based in LA, which is Tongva land. You know, on our best days, the work that we do prevents cultural genocide. But what you can read on our website says that we engage Pacific Islanders in culture-centered advocacy, leadership development, and research. And we do all of this towards this larger mission of advancing social justice. So thank you for having me.
Okay, thank you, Tavae. Next is Mary Tablante, who's with Kaya, Filipino Americans for Progress, and also the Digital Strategies Manager at MILE Group, Asian Americans Advancing Justice.
Thank you, Phil, and it's great to be with you all. So Mary Tablante again, and at Kaya, Filipino Americans for Progress. Kaya kind of means we can, or yes, we can, and we are a progressive organization that seeks to empower and politically motivate the Filipino American community. And then my role at Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC, we also seek to politically empower the community, and we do that through policy advocacy, litigation, and education.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mary. And last but not least is Nisha Ramachandran, who is the chair of Identities for Progress.
Thanks so much, Phil. Excited to be joining everyone. As Madalene mentioned, I'm stepping in for Lakshmi Sridharan. So while I'm happy to talk about Identities for Progress, and I certainly will, I also want to make sure that I shout out SALT and talk about some of the work that they're doing as the kind of pan-South Asian national organization. So for Identities for Progress, we are a South Asian progressive community organization that we really work to uplift the people, policies and ideas that uplift our South Asian community. But SALT is a pan-South Asian racial justice organization, and they have marked just 20 years of existence this year, and they address issues of immigration, civil rights, and hate violence. SALT is based in Washington, D.C., and focuses on federal policy advocacy, narrative change, and supporting the 68 and growing organizations in the National South Asian Coalition. And those organizations serve South Asians across the country. Identities for Progress works really closely with SALT, and so excited to be here and talk about both of our organizations today.
Okay, thank you so much, Nisha. As we get started, I want to just give a tiny historical context here. You're looking at a very diverse and wonderful group of panelists. When I first got started teaching Asian American studies back in the 1980s, it was mostly focused on Chinese and Japanese Americans with some Filipino American focus. There weren't as many focuses on the South Asian, Southeast Asian community. And it's just wonderful to see the diversity of people who've come on board, the number of people bringing their issues, their causes, all their strengths, their literature. So it's this panel is really showing where we are now, but it's not where we were 30, 35 years ago. So with that being said, let's start. Each panelist, please just think about what makes your particular community unique and what are the specific challenges that you are facing today, given some of that history over the past 35, 40 years. Let's start maybe with Greg, who can give us kind of the overview with the National Council.
Sure. I mean, that's a big question, and it's one that NCAPA grapples with constantly because, to your point, Phil, I think in many ways, when you think about Asian Americans or Asian American Pacific Islanders or Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, whatever, kind of umbrella term we use, we haven't done a great job of creating space for some of the underrepresented communities within our own. And there's an irony there because we're always fighting for visibility of our communities in the broader context of debates that are happening around the country. But like I said, we haven't been great, or at least always good, about creating space for Southeast Asian, Native Hawaiians, or Pacific Islanders. In many ways, if you ask the everyday American when they think Asian American, they think of someone who looks like me or someone who's East Asian. They don't think about someone who's South Asian, when in reality, the demographic shifts that have occurred over the last few years really have significantly changed what it means when we say Asian American. And so I think the work really does continue, but I'm always hopeful. I always think back, what is the best way to sort of describe, sort of in simpler terms, some of the challenges we have? And I think back to a conversation I had with our friends at Gold House. Many of you may be familiar with them. They've done a lot of really good organizing in the media and entertainment space. They said to me, Greg, you really sound like the Avengers of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander community. And I was like, I started laughing because I was like, I guess I wish I thought of that. And there are definitely some parallels. But if you remember they spend a lot of time arguing, fighting too. And so I think, you know, that's part of the work. And that's part of why I enjoy the challenge of this, is because we're not perfect and we have plenty of room to grow and be better in terms of being better partners and allies in the work. And then at the same time, you know, there's folks who challenge, well, you want to be Korean American, but then sometimes you want to be Asian American, Pacific Islander, and like you can't have it both ways. And I say that's not the case. I mean, we have multiple identities all the time. I'm thinking about recently with sports even. I'm a diehard Los Angeles sports fan, but you know, when the Olympics roll around, Team USA all the way. And so I think constantly, you know, we're navigating different identities where we're part of big groups, part of specific groups, and I think that's the beauty of it. And so we try to bring that into UNCAPA, and you know, we'll continue to try to uplift all of our member organizations, the communities they represent, and challenge them to challenge us, because that's the only way we get better at this, is by being honest and being together in it. So I'll leave it at that. But like I said, I think my other panelists have specific insights that really speak to what I'm kind of trying to get at. So I'll turn it back to you now, Phil.
Hey, Sina, what are your thoughts about this?
I love what Greg opened up with in terms of the plethora of diversity in our community, AAPIs. For us in the Southeast Asian American community, we are the largest resettlement refugee group to the US. So in this marking history, in that regard, we've faced certain challenges that is very unique to our community. Southeast Asian identity is informed by the conflicts that occurred in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam during the war in Vietnam, secret wars in Laos, and the Khmer Rouge genocide in Cambodia. And so coming to the US as a migrant group who are refugees, there is a lot of trauma as well that informs our identity, as well as our experience as Asian Americans. Most recently, we've seen Hmong Americans put to the spotlight in the movement for Black Lives, where an officer in George Floyd's shooting or death, involved a Hmong American officer. And so when we have those intersections of a newer group of refugees and immigrants, there are certain intersections such as our communities still having to deal with a lot of unresolved trauma. There's disparity rates for our communities that are very high in comparison to other Asian American populations. We have some of the highest mental illness in terms of unaddressed trauma. And so when we're looking at post-traumatic stress disorders, mental health studies and reports, we will see that for Lao families, Vietnamese communities, Cambodian families, we're at higher rates of health needs than other communities, but not receiving those resources since our arrival. And so in terms of resettlement for our community, it has been less attention. Although more widely known is the conflicts in our home countries. Since our arrival in 1975, it's our 45th anniversary this year in 2020 of our resettlement, and we're still seeing a lot of disparate rates impacting our community all across the board in terms of immigration. We're one of the most impacted Asian Americans in terms of deportations. 279% increase since 2016 in community members being deported. So for the face of deportation, the Cambodian community is less well known, but we've been impacted greatly. The Laotian community right now is facing removals and direct transfers to ICE from prison, and we have a case of a firefighter, incarcerated firefighter, who right now has a campaign fighting to be reunited with his family, but facing deportation because of the very unique experiences for the Southeast Asian community as refugees in this country. And so I will leave a report that we have, and I'll share that so you can read up in terms of statistics and learning a little bit more about our community and our unique needs. But across the line, we share a lot of the same goals and benefits in working along with our partners here on this call, as well as our neighbors and allied organizations. So there's a lot that we can work together on and supporting one another.
Thanks so much, Sina. That's very helpful. I just want to remind everybody who's watching, we have a chat function here, and if you want to put questions for our panelists in the chat, we'll be able to get to those later on. Before we go to our next speaker, I learned so much about the Pacific Island community when I was curating the Folklife Festival here in DC in 2010. We had an entire day of the festival focusing on many of the Pacific Island communities. I mean, we have people from the Marshall Islands, from, there are communities within that community. So Tavae is going to speak to us now, but I'm sure we really need a whole panel just on Pacific Islanders. So Tavae?
Thanks, Phil. You know what, that was one of my talking points, so cool, covered that. I was looking at my calendar and trying to figure out, like, it feels like this might be the 4th or 5th API diversity panel that I've been on this month or year or whatever the case. And some of that I'm sitting with, like, why it's important is because I was trying to figure out what I could say here that would feel different or nuanced or make it so that I could stop talking about diversity. Thinking about one, like when we deploy the word diversity here, we're talking specifically about race and ethnicity and wanting to acknowledge that, like, if viewed through a different lens, that our panel may seem fairly homogenous to folks, right? If looked at ability or gender and sexuality or class, all of these things where we work at the intersection of. The other piece that I'm thinking about around diversity is, like, what necessitates us talking about diversity, right? That all things equal and equitable, it wouldn't matter if a space was homogenous, if everyone looked the same, right? That it would be homogenous by choice. But that lack of diversity has come to be a measurement of just how inequitable our systems are. That when someone isn't at the table, when someone isn't in our communities, when someone isn't able to participate in decision making, that it's actually about lack of access, that's the story that we lift up, right? And then there's this other piece, right, where we talk about the diversity of the API community because it's so frequently represented as a monolith, as Greg was noting earlier. But there's this other piece too, is like that speaks to the insidiousness of racism, that it could manifest itself in so many different ways in all of our communities, that it could look historically like the Chinese Exclusion Act, it could look like the school, the prison to deportation pipeline, and it looks like nuclear testing in the Marshall Islands, right? That it could look so many different ways to have racism shape the presence of our communities here. And so when I talk about the social construction of race of Pacific Islanders here on the continent, it's with this very specific understanding that the ways in which Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders are able to access systems, land, health, whatever they need in order to survive is deeply shaped by their relationships to the US, both formal and informal. Understanding, like, what happens to our communities, right? That the racism that we experience as Pacific Islanders, both covert and overt, is underpinned by anti-Blackness and anti-indigeneity. And that from the beginning, the justification for taking our lands, suppressing our people, was white supremacy. And so in thinking about Pacific Islanders and thinking about our work with each other, it's really, I think I spend a lot of time going, like, what about Pacific Islanders in API spaces? And the most anti-racist approach would actually be that understanding, like, oh, all of us are actually trying to dismantle white supremacy. And that beyond sort of organizing ourselves under this API banner, it's this also shared value that, like, not only are we API, but I think Mary had specifically stated earlier, like, that we're progressive APIs, right? That we're folks who also, like, believe that families belong together, that we believe Black Lives Matter, that we would call out these things, right? and that sort of being a uniting force. And truthfully, there was this other piece where I was just trying to think about like which Avenger the PIs would be in the full squad. But I'll pause there. So thank you.
Thank you. Next, let's have Mary come and talk with both of her hats, her Filipino American hat, and then maybe a little bit about what Asian Americans Advancing Justice is doing.
Yeah, so first of all, I'd like to just say to everybody, happy Filipino American History Month. So October marks what we call FAM, and that is thanks to the Filipino American National Historical Society, who in 1992 did a resolution forming the day because Filipinos are actually the first Asian population to step into what is now the United States. So they landed in Morro Bay, what is now Morro Bay, California in October 1587 because of Spanish galleon ships. And then October, or the end of October, marks the birthday of labor leader and farm labor leader Lariat Leong. So having said that, you kind of get a sense of the storied history that Filipinos have in this country. We are, I believe, the second or third largest Asian ethnic group in the US. And that means that even, I think 2 years ago, the American Community Survey said that there's now 4 million of us. But ever since our presence in this country has grown, we've also been one of the most invisible Asian Americans. And part of that is because of colonization and assimilation. So the Philippines was colonized for 400 years by the Spanish, and then at the Spanish-American War from 1898 to 1946 is when the Philippines was actually a US colony. So when you ask who are Filipino Americans, we're not monolithic in ourselves. So it's the same way the AAPI community is not. We're not just this one category that you can put into a box. We have such a rich history of organizing, from the farm workers to serving in the sugar plantations in Hawaii to being veterans and fighting and dying for this country. We fought in World War II for the Americans, and many of us are facing this kind of identity crisis. We've been called the Latinos of Asia because of that Spanish colonization. We have been boxed into this role that we are, that we're doing okay and that we're just, happy all the time, as some of our higher profile folks are maybe celebrities. We might be singers or even boxers, but really we're immigrants of all statuses. We are not only one language, we're not all Tagalog. We have a rich indigenous culture and community, and we are not all one religion, even though Catholicism has been a predominant religion in our community. So having said that, obviously immigration and health has really impacted our community throughout our history, similar to the history of Asian American immigration. Even though we had this relationship as a US colony with the US, the population exploded after 1965, thanks to the immigration laws, where we really saw these high-skilled workers. So another common thing that we say is that Filipinos our labor is the largest export in this country. We come here to fill roles as nurses, as essential workers, as school teachers in communities that are underserved. We saw a report recently that the National Nurses Union, one of the largest nurses unions, said that although Filipino nurses represent 4% of the overall nursing population, we have died at alarming rates. I think it's around 30%. So it just begs this question, like, we aren't just labor, we are so much more than that, yet we continue to be treated as expendable.
Okay, thanks so much, Mary. Nisha, do you want to speak about the South Asian experience?
Sure, thanks, Phil. I would start by mentioning that there are over 4.3 million South Asians in the United States. This is, similar to, I think, a lot of the folks on this call are the groups that we're here to represent, and the communities we're here to represent are super diverse. And so South Asian is, I think, in the past decade, we're hearing the term South Asian being used amongst the community so much more as a more inclusive term. It's not just Indian Americans, that includes Pakistani, folks from Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Nepal. I'm probably missing a couple, but we're not a monolith. And so even when you talk about the Indian American community, there's so much diversity in that. And then to expand that to this whole region, there are so many different experiences. And it's almost like when you think about the AAPI community and the model minority myth, we almost have our own kind of version of the model minority myth within the South Asian community. That said, taking a step back from that, I wanted to just start by talking about the South Asian experience and the idea of this community being part of the broader AAPI community, which for many South Asian folks is not how, and I would include myself in this, grow up thinking about ourselves as Asian American. Greg noted earlier that when people think Asian American, they think, folks that look like him. And I think the South Asian community would broadly agree with that. People for most of my life wouldn't have looked at me and said Asian American. I wouldn't have looked at myself and thought Asian American until I started getting it more involved with the community and learning about these issues and how, how we are part of this broader community. And I know we'll get to that later. But, the idea that we all have our own unique kind of challenges on issues and our own unique kind of ways we're handling them, and the solutions we need are unique as well. And so just a couple of more specific issues that the South Asian community broadly has been facing, especially especially since 9/11. Obviously a huge rise in hate violence and racial profiling since that time. And specifically, even in more recent past, and SALT did a great report on this that came out a few years ago around the 2016 election and the huge uptick in hate crimes and violence that we saw in terms of racial profiling and race-based violence towards the South Asian community that continued from 2016, from the election time in through the beginning of this new administration. And we've seen that again happening with COVID-19 as well as, that's something that's affected the broader API community, but South Asians as well. I would also mention that, I think all of our groups, many of our groups, I should say, have specific issues around the immigration front. I think when people think South Asian, they think very stereotypically in many cases, Indian tech worker, right? But it's actually so much more than that. We have folks kind of in every industry. We have every immigration status involved, every visa type. It's not just H-1B, but I would mention that is a major specific immigration issue. H-1B, H-4 visas, and particularly, some of the more recent potential administration actions around those visa types have been of particular concern. And then finally, I would just mention COVID. I think, obviously we can't have a lot of conversations nowadays without talking about how COVID particularly has affected the community. And so SALT actually just this week put out a report, and I will drop the link into the chat for you all. And they did a community survey mapping the impact of COVID-19 on South Asian communities. And so I definitely recommend everyone check it out. But really what we see is that the South Asian population across the US, who are the same ones who were primarily targeted after 9/11, who were the most impacted by this administration's, frankly, racist policies towards immigration and otherwise, and are the most vulnerable to COVID-19, are also the populations that are the most marginalized within our own communities, whether that's because of immigration status, whether that's because of class, caste, religion, or being LGBT, part of the LGBTQ community. And so we see that these kind of compound on each other. And just one or two quick things before I stop talking about, particularly around the impact of COVID that we see specific to the South Asian community, has been a big increase in gender-based domestic violence. This is something that, especially in the South Asian community, is everyone knows that it's an issue particular to communities, yet something that we rarely talk about. That said, based on the survey that SALT did, every single survivor support organization that they interviewed explicitly named a drastic increase in gender-based domestic violence as an issue. I would also mention, specifics around immigration, for example, as related to COVID. The fear of being able to travel outside of the US, but also, as I mentioned, recent executive orders targeting green cards, targeting H-1B workers, and visas, and student visas as well. So I think we see that the marginalized in the South Asian community are also the same ones that get impacted time and again. I would leave it there for now. I think there's a lot that we can all keep talking about, but interested in hearing more from others.
Okay, thank you, Nisha. At this point, we're going to start looking at some of the intersectionalities, ways that these good people and others are working together. At the same time, I'd like to ask each one of us and each one of the people sitting in on this panel to commit yourself to a lifetime of learning. I mean, really, each one of these panelists has 20 more stories you can learn from. Some of them have started to give us some resources that we could look at. I can tell you that after teaching Asian American Studies courses for several decades, I'm still learning new stuff from this panel and from everything I do. And so we really can't just say, okay, Nisha, tell me everything there is to know about the South Asian community. No, take it upon yourself. The first time I was teaching Asian American Studies, I didn't know anything about it. And there was a young woman who was an Indian American. I said, could you please ask your mom to recommend somebody? And a friend of hers came and talked to our class. I sat in the back and took notes. And that was the beginning of my trying to learn more about South Asians and others in the Asian American community. So with that being said, let's go around. I don't want to be so structured here. If any of you wants to start saying something, what are some stories that can help us to understand how you have grown up as an Asian American Pacific Islander, ways that you have learned to work with some of the other communities that are represented here? Anybody want to start?
I can go first. I think for me, as a Korean American adoptee, obviously my Asian American experience is a little bit different, and I think it's one of the things that I've grown to love. I fully admit I was late to the game, and I didn't really lean into my Asian American identity until I got to college, like many people, honestly. But we joke about this now, but many of my friends still give me a hard time for the fact that if given the choice between a good sandwich and a good bowl of rice, I'm still going to go with sandwich. That's just the way I grew up. I think that doesn't make me any less Asian American. I think it just makes me part of that sort of beautiful fabric that we're talking about. And so for me, also a little bit more about my background, I spent a good amount of time working on Capitol Hill for a member of the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressman Al Green, really learning from him and his chief of staff, the late Jackie Ellis. And I think for me, being shaped by that, being able to work, in and around different communities of color really helped me understand that ultimately we're all in this together. I think to Tavae's point, the systems that we're ultimately trying to change require effort and, concerted, effort from all of us at the same time. And there's plenty of different ways to tackle it. And so, coming to UNCAPA and recognizing that there are so many diverse communities within the broader Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander umbrella, is how do we create that platform for everyone to really step up and, be seen? How do we assemble the vendors in our entirety? How do we, kind of realize that all of the different parts we bring to the table actually create a much stronger basis for us to do our work? But there will be moments where individual communities should be pushed front and center and uplifted. And that doesn't take away from us, or it doesn't take away from me as a Korean American, it really adds to it, because we really have to come together to sort of dismantle some of these systems.
I appreciate everything you've been saying. It's all very interesting. Can you give us a specific example? Give us a story that paints a picture, something happened with Representative Green, something that really triggered your coming of age as an Asian American or as a person of color?
Yeah, I mean, I think just being here is something I've reflected on quite a bit. And what I mean by that is having this position within GAPA. You know, with Congressman Green, I came on as a fellow through Apex, so thank you, Apex. It's also a shout out to like the great work that they do. But you know, getting moved up to legislative director, then deputy chief of staff, and then chief of staff, that doesn't happen without the support of the congressman and, you know, Jack Ellis. You know, those are two folks from the Black community that took a chance on this Asian American kid because they believed that, you know, he could do the work. But without that, I don't make those moves. And without that, I probably don't come to a GAPA in the role that I'm in. So I'm deeply shaped by sort of allyship from, you know, amongst communities of color. And so, you know, one thing that always stuck with me as far as what Jackie told me was, she said to me, Greg, I want to build a team that looks like the world around me. You know, it's like we are a member of the Congressional Black Caucus and we represent Houston, Texas, which is one of the most diverse cities in the country. We have to have folks from these different communities because that's really what we're about. And so I take those lessons to heart when doing this work within GAPA, and not just within the Asian American Pacific Islander community, but also how do we sort of connect with the broader civil rights movement, or, you know, the racial justice movement as well.
Okay, thank you. Tavae, could you take that same thought process there? There are people on this discussion who want to know how can they be your ally? How can they work with Pacific Islander communities? Obviously, we don't want you to do all the work and educate us. Is there something that we can do ourselves? And is there a story you can tell us that illustrates a good way that this was done and maybe a bad way that this was done when you came here to work with our broader communities?
Oh, Phil, you're trying to get me in trouble. So this is what I'm thinking about, right? Because there's a little bit of this question that feels like a racial justice life map of like, oh, when did you realize you were this race, that you are a racialized being and body? There are also identities that are thrust upon you at birth, gender reveal party, right? There are things you come into, right? Like I didn't know I was API until I went to college, right? So the vast majority of the folks that we work with are like, if higher education is inaccessible, then the notion of API also doesn't enter your being, right? If you are not civically engaged, then API is not a thing for you. There's this other piece where the vast majority of folks that we work with work from a very ethnic specific lens, right? That they are Samoan, that they are Native Hawaiian, that they are Tongan, and that we teach them Pacific Islander. And then our efforts to be like, oh, so if I actually want PIs to show up to something, I don't call it API. The API for years has been, since its inception, right, has been a broken promise and actually has represented the erasure of Pacific Islanders. So that's the caveat, right? The question about how to be an ally, I'm like, I don't need any more allies. I have some really dope allies. I would love to collect more accomplices. I would love to find folks who will designate resources, will like be, you know, will fight that fight. Well, I'm more concerned about the thing you do when I'm not there, the thing that you do when there are no PIs present, right? Because I'm really clear about the ways that we're connected. That the bombs that they dropped in Southeast Asia, they tested in the Pacific Islands, right? That the other piece to think about too and be clear is like, how do we talk about API without also confronting that the presence of Asians in the Pacific Islands is a function of colonization and imperialism, right? That many of these communities were brought to the Pacific Islands for the exploitation of your labor. That like, while they were consuming you, they were consuming us too. And as Mary was sharing, right, that the largest export of the Philippines is labor. The biggest exports from American Samoa and Guahan and other parts of Micronesia are soldiers, right? That they continue, that we are not post-colonial as a people, that we continue to be colonized. And so you know, there's like these really simple step-by-steps that I could give folks a list and be like, hey, if you're on an API panel, can you check that there are PIs on it? And if there aren't, can you ask? Can you raise that flag? There's this other piece too, where then I find myself stuck as the only PI that most people know. And so that is why this is the 4th, 5th, like API diversity panel that I've been on in less than a year. So how are you building relationships with PIs? And if you don't have those relationships, that's indicative of the fact that you actually should not be saying API. That API is also an accountability term, a way to call folks in. So if you don't have PIs at your table, then you actually should not be trying to call in that community. And then I think that sort of relationship, and you know, on an Adrienne Maree Brown tip of like fractals, right, where she says that anything that happens on a small scale will inevitably reproduce itself on a large scale, and that we often don't talk to each other until we're at that large scale moment. So what is the small scale investment that you're making? Okay, I'm gonna get off my soapbox now. Thank you.
Well, a lot to think about there. I mean, one thing that I tell my students to do is just take a look at your Facebook page and look at all the people who are on there and how many people are like you and how many are not. I mean, when the Black Lives Matter situation happened, how many people who are African-American are on your group of intimates, people that you talk to, rely on you? I mean, these are questions we need to ask ourselves. Another question that Abdul Aziz, one of our listeners, just asked was, what are the preferred identifiers? How would you like to be addressed? Because we have these blanket terms. I know when I first started, my family is Japanese American, and actually they didn't call themselves Japanese. They were from Kagoshima. So they were from this small place at the southern part of Japan. And then we became Japanese American, then we became Asian American, then Asian Pacific Islander and all this other stuff. So how do you feel comfortable? Sina, what about the Southeast Asians? How do you feel comfortable being described?
Sure, thanks, Phil. And I loved everything you said, Tavae, in terms of PI representation and how to go about engaging your community and how not to. That's so important for the Southeast Asian community too, because for us, when we are clumped up with Asian Americans as a umbrella term, our narratives and our experiences get lost too. We know that Southeast Asians face the highest rates of deportation in this country, but yet our stories find it very difficult to make it to mainstream attention and news, even though for SEARAC we advocate for families and work with legislators who are champions. We definitely need more, and the education piece is really important, as many of the panelists here have already shared for their personal experience in terms of their own awakening and politicizing their identity and coming into it. And I think others have already mentioned in terms of the way in which racism, identity works in this country. It is quite difficult for a group like AAPIs, who are over 150 different countries and even more languages and dialects and history, especially in connection with US colonialism, imperialism, home country histories, to learn of it, to know of it. For Southeast Asians in the political context, we try as much as possible to uplift our stories of disparities because of the model minority myths that is common amongst AAPIs as groups who are successful and groups who are non-political or do not engage with policy and policymakers. So for our community, it has been, in the 4 decades that we have been here, a struggle in resettlement, and then moving to creating identity as Asian Americans, and then to articulate our specific needs as Southeast Asian Americans, Cambodians, Laotians, Hmong, Mien, Khmer, Vietnamese, community members. We are some of the hardest hit in terms of poverty rates and access to education, language barriers. So navigating those landscapes can be difficult in those 4 decades. And I understand for many of our elders and folks who have really been just trying to survive and maneuver in this country, it's difficult to then try and extend into a political united identity that really asserts our needs and our importance. And so I think for us in this last decade, where deportations is the most important issue separating our families, is that we work across movements and those who have come before us in this political work and learning from them as well. All the history that's been shared by the other panelists, there's so much connection in terms of shared experience or similar challenges. And right now we face, increase in anti-Asian racism. So those issues are important, but for Southeast Asians, the younger generation is just completing college, finishing their higher education, working in organizations like SEARAC to really push forward our stories, our statistics, our identities. And so it's difficult for Southeast Asians to be seen under the larger AAPI umbrella, but we are leading some of the most important policy work in terms of immigration, anti-deportation, in terms of mental health in California, in terms of Southeast Asian studies in California and Washington, the leaders in international work in countries in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, and mitigating repatriation agreements with those countries. And so, pushing back on sanctions that the US is enforcing, travel bans under the current administration. And so with the struggles and a lot of the leadership from our community, we know and recognize that we're strongest when we work across coalitions and communities and uplift one another and not fight for resources or feel any type of slights when others are in the spotlight or ahead of that narrative of what that issue may be that's impacting our communities most, because what we found in terms of supporting our issues when we are working with the Movement for Black Lives, when we're working with Pacific Islanders, when we're working with East Asians, South Asians, Latinx community, Arab Americans, just all across the board, those who really are impacted by all these disparities and issues too. It may take some time as a newer immigrant, and it takes a few generations to actually have a lot of political presence and impact. And so joining with those who are already doing the work, who have done the work and learning from it, has definitely been one of our greatest assets in our community.
Wow, thanks. There's a lot of information there, Sina. We've got to really think about a lot of things. Mary, could you pick up on that? And the Filipino American community has been around a long time. We had the Manong generation, a lot of people speaking Ilocano, people who were, not the professional generation that we think of now. We think of a lot of Filipino Americans. And maybe pick up on what Sina's been talking about. How do you talk about these things in a cross-generational way? How has that sense of identity that some of our panelists got by going to college, how was that shaped for you and other younger Filipino Americans? Was it done in the community through groups like the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance, which has a lot of Filipino Americans, or through Kaya and some of the other groups? How did that identity develop, and how do you talk about that within your community?
Yeah, thanks. On a personal level, I think that when we're having these conversations about identity, it's important to understand that it's going to evolve through years, through decades. So we might have, there was a time when Oriental was the preferred term for our communities, but obviously that is still changing, and it's going to change through different immigration patterns. And you can ask maybe 10 different Filipinos how they identify, and some of them might not even say they identify as Asian. So when we ask about our identity, it's important to be specific. It's important to just ask the question. And for me, I think I've been also involved since college, and I spent the first years of my career at Greg's organization, the National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, and that's where I really started to see how this coalition building works. And we have been involved together in so many different kinds of campaigns. And in one campaign that we're doing now is the Value Our Families campaign for the past 2 or 3 years. And with that, it's a really cross-coalition group that not only includes Asian Americans, and it also has other communities of color and faith-based groups. So we really saw success there, especially with working with Rep. Judy Chu on the Reuniting Families Act and getting over 60 co-sponsors on that. And on a more Filipino-specific issue with the Filipino Veterans Parole Program, which started 5 or so years ago. It was finally a way to get the contributions of World War II Filipino veterans recognized, even if many of them are no longer with us, so that their families finally have a way to either be reunited here or emigrate here. And we wouldn't be able to do that with just our community. We had to rely on other people too. And I think too, talking across generations, it's important to be patient. Not everybody is at the same level. And we tend to just, I think, be more like, be more accusatory, I think, now as we're in these really heightened times, really stressful times. So I think it's important to always just take a step back and remember that we have these shared histories and shared stories. And for the longest time that our stories were told by and even now our stories were told by colonizers, by white folks. And we're only beginning to scratch the surface of our own history and our evolving history. So once we realize the power that we have and the power that we have collectively to raise our voices, we can all, make a difference in all of the causes that matter to us.
Okay, thanks so much, Mary. I have a question now for Nisha. Given the history of the South Asian community here, I mean, you look back at the Gadar movement back in the 30s, people fighting for freedom in their homelands from the United States, up through the present. I mean, now we see a lot of South Asians and we say, oh, they're all doctors and computer people, but the South Asians at the turn of the century were lumberjacks and agriculture people. So the whole perception of themselves and of them from outsiders has changed. What do you see as a Desi, South Asian person? What's going on within your family, within your community, as you try to interact with other people within South Asian, quote unquote, South Asian community? I mean, even within Pakistan and India, there are some battles going on in Asia. How do you try to find commonalities within the South Asian label?
I think that's a great question. And you're right. I mean, I think we think of, like you said, you think of Indian doctors and I guess more recently lawyers, I guess for some. And it's so much more than that, right? And so I mentioned previously, the diversity of the South Asian community, and for groups like SALT and Bases for Progress, you know, in terms of bringing them together and seeing that we have shared histories in, you know, in these homeland countries. And we've had folks here who have come here in many different ways, right? They're not, I mentioned a particular issue that kind of uniquely affects the South Asian community around H-1Bs and around H-4 visas, but let's be honest, we have folks here from, you know, all the same immigration issues that the broader API, or at least the broader Asian American, I should say, space that we're seeing, and that groups like AJC, like NCAPA, like SEARAC are fighting. All of us have folks who are, you know, undocumented immigrants. We have folks who are, we're fighting for programs like DACA, right? Fighting for TPS, temporary protected status, asylum. All of these things are happening from all of our communities. So to separate from kind of just the South Asian community, the power of the coalition of working together and showing up for each other, I think is really important. And that's something that we're seeing both in terms of, so it kind of connects actually a lot of the questions that have been asked, you know, everything from what do we want to call ourselves, right? What do we call folks from these communities? That's really personal to each individual. You know, right now we have, people are using South Asian, and I identify as South Asian, but you have a lot of that older generation that would, and it's something that's been coming up a lot recently, is don't call me South Asian, I'm Indian American. It's like, okay, there's a clear generational divide I've seen. And it's a personal, you know, how you want to be identified. I don't think there's always a clear right answer for some of these. I think the second thing, in terms of how we're kind of working together, is really understanding the power of, again, building community together, showing up for each other. And for the South Asians, I would say especially right now has been this pivotal political moment for us, right? We have a South Asian and Black woman who is on the presidential ticket, right, as the vice presidential candidate. That is something that, you know, I think so much of our community is celebrating as a milestone, regardless of maybe all the, you know, political and policy implications. The idea that you have someone that's come from one of these communities. That also is not something that the entire community is celebrating, because let's be real, there's also a real insidious, I think was a word that maybe Tavae used, that I will steal, a sentiment of anti-Blackness in the South Asian community broadly. There's also a sentiment, a very strong, I would say, anti-Muslim sentiment within the South Asian community. When you think of South Asians and you think of, you know, post 9/11 hate crimes and things like that, you're thinking, you know, a lot about the Muslim community, anti-Muslim hate. And that's not just happening from outside, that happens within our community as well. So there's a lot we have to talk to ourselves and each other about, these shared kind of experiences. And I mentioned before a couple of those, you know, the marginalized within the South Asian community, right? Whether that's based on immigration status, on religion, on class or caste, which is another kind of another factor that is when we're talking about South Asian communities, particularly in the American communities, we have to think about. So I think there's a lot that we have to do to educate each other within the South Asian community, but also outside that. And you know, to the point that we are kind of everywhere, right? At this, on one hand, you have our first Asian American member of Congress was an Indian American man, right? A Sikh American, elected in 1957. And so we've definitely, in terms of the broader South Asian political power, have grown since then. You know, we have 4 members of the House. We have countless, at this point, so Daisies for Progress does a nonpartisan candidate tracker, where we're just tracking South Asian candidates at every level. And I can guarantee there's folks we're missing, so feel free to check it out. I'll drop the link in the chat box, and if we're missing folks, let us know. But we have more folks running from our communities than we've ever had in the past. All parties, all levels, everywhere from city councils and school boards, all the way up to being on the vice presidential ticket. So I think it's something where we're coming together. That said, there's always, you know, there's always division, I think, with every one of our communities. When we think about, you know, what's important on the issues and where, when we talk about community values, right? I think it's hard to say this is how all South Asians feel about an issue or how all Asian Americans feel about an issue. We all know in all of our communities there's diversity in that thought, but the idea that we're a growing political power is also something that I think a lot of folks, especially right now, are really, really talking about. I'm not sure if that fully answered your question. That was thoughts for you.
Well, again, we need an entire panel just on the South Asian experience. I mean, that's why it's great. All of you are synthesizing this stuff. But again, I encourage everyone on this discussion to please take the time afterwards to follow up with each of these groups and learn more on your own. Riza, one of our listeners here, is asking, how have your groups directed your efforts into understanding the story of others? And I'd like to direct that question to Greg, because through your work with the Black Caucus and with others, how do you apportion your personal time? How do you apportion your group's time? How would you encourage the rest of us to spend time learning about people who are not like ourselves in order to make your political and frankly, your whole life more effective and more enjoyable?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the central question to this, because building a more unified movement is something that it just requires constant stewardship and care. And it ultimately falls on us, right? Like, it is, I think in some ways we can get overwhelmed with the task at hand, right? It has been a certain way for so long. The narrative of what Asian American Pacific Islander means has sort of been set in stone by other people. Well, if we don't like it, let's work to change it. And so with folks on this panel and folks within NCAPA, one of the things I'm always talking about with fellow executive directors is what can we do to be, in a better position to serve you as a member of our coalition? What are things that we can be doing better? Where are we falling short? And, that's sometimes those are tough conversations, but I genuinely believe that that's the only way we move forward, is having that sort of willingness to be honest with each other, to really do some real introspection about what it means to be committed to building a more unified movement, in whatever term we end up calling it. That's something I try to stay focused on. Obviously, there's many other things that pull us in lots of different directions, but ultimately, what this really comes down to is we have a choice, right? We can wait until 2055 when Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders have the demographic numbers to really be seen, quote unquote, or we can start the work now. Like, I don't want to wait 35 years. I mean, who knows where I'll be in 35 years? Who knows where any of us will be in 35 years, but the work should start now. And I think with a lot of the viewers and listeners and the young folks, it really is a question of how do we start building into our baseline DNA this work of inclusion, and rather than just talk the talk of inclusion, really start thinking about how do we start to really build into our practice what that means. And I'll be the first one to admit I can do better, and I think that's where it starts. We all have to take it on ourselves to just really start thinking about what it means to be a part of this work together.
Tavae, could you take that same question? As soon as we end this program, what would you like for me personally to do to learn more about Pacific Islanders? I mean, think about it in those personal terms. What can I do personally to learn more about Pacific Islanders, to be a better ally, to be a better advocate, to represent Pacific Islanders in the room, like you say, when you're not there?
I'm so sorry. My mom was actually just asking me what I want from Jack in the Box for lunch. Can you ask the question one more time?
Oh, okay.
I swear
No,
I'm present.
I'm just thinking, I mean, you are a representative of a group within our group that is less known. And so I'm just wondering if I, as a person, want to end this call and go from here and learn more about Pacific Islanders, just as one example. I mean, we could do the same question to our Southeast Asian and other colleagues here. What would you like me personally to do, and other panelists, to learn more about the Pacific Islander community, and how can we be better allies in that way?
Okay, yeah. I think there are a couple of different things, right? I've heard this notion of representation come up a couple of different times on this panel. And really, I think the scholar Stuart Hall talks about there's no such thing as good or bad representation. It's that you actually need a multiplicity of representation so that nothing becomes a single story. So there's this part of it, like, I really hope that The Rock is not the only PI that you get, like, your notions of what PI identity is. And I think this is the other thing that I grapple with is, how often people talk about our invisibility but I feel hyper visible, right? Like we've got Jason Momoa, we've got The Rock, we've got all of these people who are actually like, there's a constant need to actually consume our culture, but in our absence, right? And so there are scholars you can read, there's art that you consume, there's all of these things that I hope like become part of shaping it. And I also think I'm also in a learning space and place, right? That I'm really honest that my political consciousness was formed by Black feminism, right? By Angela Davis and Audre Lorde. Like that is not that I do the work that I do for the Pacific Islander community, not because I only care about PIs, but because those are the people that I am most responsible for bringing in and collecting. And so if people are looking to like, how do you figure out understanding the Pacific Islander community? There's not one thing that you can do. I actually need you to do 20, 40, 50 things. And even then you will still not be an expert. And so, you know, Teresia Teaiva has been really big part, especially lately for myself, because she talks a lot about what it means to be Black and Pacific Islander. Also being clear about the racial construction of PI here on the continent is different from that in Hawaii, which is different from that of New Zealand. Thinking about actually, let me stop there. I gave people a lot of homework. So there's definitely a reading list, there's a movie list, there's a whole lot of stuff. I'm down to talk to you about it so we can learn together, but I think there's this other piece to understand that if another Pacific Islander comes and tells you something completely different from what I tell you, they're right too. That in the Pacific Islander, sort of the axioms of our storytelling is like, one, in Samoa, you're not even supposed to tell a story that's not from your village, because you as the storyteller impact like what is perceived. There's number two, that like when we do tell story, which talking story is the way that we disseminate our knowledge, we do it with a great deal of responsibility and with permission. And there's this other piece too, that like you as a receiver of that story are also an active participant. So what you glean from it is just as indicative of who you are and where you are in your process as it is of the community that you're choosing to learn and observe and consume in some way. Yeah, I'm gonna stop there.
Oh, that's great. We're getting to the end of the program. I'd like to give each of our panelists a minute to answer a similar question. The panel is going to be over in a few minutes. What would you like me personally to do, and the other people listening? What is there something I can read, someone I can talk to, something I can do? Obviously, I want to be a better person, to be a more effective person, to able to work with you and other people and help to build a better world. What can I do, Sina? Take a minute.
Sure. For closing thoughts, there's so much that was already shared by Greg and Tavae. It's like a million things people can do, literally, and tap into the resources and leaders that are a part of our communities and our movements. So I think my tangible advice is that folks who care and are moved to want to learn more or do something, just take action. It doesn't matter how small or big it is, especially if you're newer to any of this type of movement work. Coalitions, you know, like being an activist or advocate is not the only way you can participate. There's so many ways, and that if you want to engage, there's resources, there's leaders, but just really take responsibility in your learning, in your action. So for our community, in the Southeast Asian community, it's tough to get communities who are impacted and families who are impacted to come forward to talk about their stories and to share about their experiences because of the shame and the embarrassment that comes from talking about issues. And so just breaking that barrier to be someone to reach out, to learn, to speak up makes a big difference. You know, seeing us all on this panel from different groups and communities is a way that we're showing up today to share our experiences as well as our resources. But anyone can do this, like anyone. So please just take action, no matter how small or big, and just start, it starts with learning, and it's okay to make mistakes. We all do it. No one is perfect in the movement, in this work, and we have generations to go. So tap in, support each other, love each other.
Well, thank you. Yeah, what I usually tell my students is we're swimming in an ocean of isms and we're all wet. We all grew up in a world that was sexist, racist, homophobic, ageist, on and on and on. And we have to make mistakes, and we have to be loving toward each other, and have to be gracious and keep moving forward. How about that same question? Mary, any final thoughts for people, how we can move forward?
Yeah, first, just by acknowledging that you can't do it all as one person. We're so overwhelmed and bombarded with these events, with everything that's impacting us on an individual and on a societal level. So I think this is a great first start. If you're watching this, you probably have internet access, so you're already exposed to our organizations. So keep following us and look at who we follow, because you are your media diet, and look at what you consume on your social media and where you watch. You can do things like, if you're in the DC area, Kaya collaborates a lot with Nisha's group, Identities for Progress, and other Asian American political groups. So that's a great way to step in. There's phone banks happening every day. And then on a C3 level, you could follow AAJC, and we have a ton of events going on, including things like bystander trainings and media trainings. So those are just some ways that you can grow and develop your own social justice identity, as well as growing your own personal skills. And I think we talk about self-care during this time a lot, and we also need to think about our community care and what we're doing to support each other. So
great, thank you very much. Same question to Nisha.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, I just want to echo Mary's statement about you can't do it all alone. And I think, when you're working in these spaces and trying to, do as much as you can for, any of our communities, the broader community, the things that are important to you, issues, et cetera, you can't do it alone. And so I just will echo what Mary said on that. I think in terms of these organizations, things to do. For SALT, number one, go read their COVID report. I have been reading it this week, and it's fascinating. And it will help you learn a lot, even if you're not very familiar with the South Asian community. As Mary mentioned, on the political organization ends, Identities for Progress works really closely with groups like Kaya. And, a lot of that is working together in this broader API space, collaborating together. And some of that is relational, right? Mary and I both met each other when we started working at NCAPA many years ago. And through being friends with that and now chairing these organizations, partner whenever we can to bring our groups together. And so, I think for SALT, of course, read the report. For Identities for Progress, I would definitely say, check out the tracker I put in the link. And as Mary mentioned, we're all doing a whole bunch of events, so feel free to check out our website. I'll drop that in as well for some activities coming up and ways to get involved. I mean, I think every single one of our organizations are doing things, whether that's issue-based, whether that's political, and have ways to just learn more. And so I would definitely recommend that. And I would also just close with the idea that, it's really important, I think, to have panels like this one to talk about the fact that we have kind of these different and unique issues that we're facing, but it's also really important to keep in mind that working together in coalition really gets a lot done. And so for organizations, like in NCAPA and the work that Greg is doing there, I think, being able to harness the power and the uniqueness of each of these organizations to move us all forward is really important. So I would end with that.
Hey, thank you. I noticed that a number of people are putting resources, books, websites into the chat function, so please check that out. Tavae and Greg, we're down to our last minute. Do you have any very quick thought before I turn it back to Madalene? No, you're okay?
I would say everyone has an opportunity to challenge and do that narrative change work that we're talking about. Whether it's in your personal life or your professional life, every single person on the panel and in the audience will have an opportunity to question, hopefully, when you're talking about Asian Americans, are you also talking about South Asian, Southeast Asian, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islanders? It's a simple question that you can pose. I challenge all of us to continue to do that because it's going to take time, but it's going to take us to do that work. So I really hope that everyone can sort of take that one maybe recommended action away from this.
Tavae, you want the last word?
Nope.
No? Okay. Got to get back to mom's lunch, right?
This is also the most PI thing ever, like that I would be on a panel and my mom's just like does not care. And so if you ever needed an example of PI cultural practice, the mom deciding that what she needs done is far more important than anything I could be communicating to you all. So yeah, that's all the word I've got.
Okay, so let's return then to Madalene, who's executive director here, and frankly, a personal, the personification of working across the board and building API representation here in DC and across the country. So Madalene, you want the final word?
Thank you so much, Phil. I appreciate all of your kind words and for moderating today's panel, and to the panelists themselves, thank you for always having patience, even when it seems like that might be a well that dries up, and being able to continuously educate all of us and make sure that we are keeping our promise to see one another and make sure that each of us have our stories told. So thank you for this fantastic discussion. It was the perfect conversation to end our legislative leadership series this afternoon, and we thank all of you out there in the audience for joining us over the past 2 months for these important panel discussions. We'd also like to thank all of our sponsors throughout the series for their support of these panels. And these panels themselves would not be possible without the work of the APEX team, so I really want to shout them out and especially highlight Nisha Ramachandran and managing all of these events once a week in August and 2 times a week in September. So it's a lot of panel discussions to manage, and so really want to thank her for all of her leadership. And I want to invite you to join us tonight at 6:30 Eastern. We are having our virtual prom. It's APEX celebration. It's not too late to sign up, so join us. You can visit the APEX website at www.apex.org to sign up. Enjoy the rest of your day, and I look forward to seeing you tonight at Celebration. Thanks so much.